where we are. So, and I've always been interested in creating stories and hearing from people about their experiences and molding that into different narratives with their, with their permission and their collaboration, the people that you're talking to. So after the live radio stuff, I dipped into podcasting, stepped away from public radio for a little bit and did some podcasting, worked with Virginia Humanities, and came back to public radio and have done podcasting with WNC for about 2 years now. And it's been really great. I feel like fulfilling that initial mission of meeting people where they are has been really satisfying, and working with them along the way to not only report the news, but also hear from folks about their experiences in North Carolina and the South.
All right, thank you. Aaryan.
Just as meaningfully as those answers, I was 15 years old and wanted to make a podcast about competitive Pokemon, which is a Japanese children's video game. But sort of that high school and production sort of interest led its way into college and working with TJU down in Charlottesville, and sort of backed my way into a fascination with politics and understanding, especially state politics here in Virginia. Produced a show for about a year and a half through TJU, and then sort of moved that into working with Michael here actually on Pod Virginia and with the Poverty Law Center on issues involving poverty. So started on the production side, then kind of figured out that journalism is a really good place to use those skills.
This is Hodges. My story about Willis Hodges is my first podcast. I mean, it began as it could have been any kind of story at first. I found a tale about him in the archives in the Library of Virginia, and I kept digging and digging. And what I realized is that the podcast format let me tell a story serially, right? And tell it in a way that was compelling and use voices. And I wanted to do that, I think, because I've listened to so many murder podcasts, that it was, kind of in my makeup that I wanted to, there was something very exciting about that format. And I thought this could match to what I was doing.
Well, my background actually is in newspapers. When I was in college, I started writing for the local newspaper with the obituaries and the crime report and the student spotlight, and sort of eventually worked my way up to doing, state government, local government. And for a long time, I did newspaper full time, and then I started working in public radio. And at a certain point, I switched that, and I did public radio full time and newspapers part time. And then one day, the co-host of my podcast approached me and said, "Hey, I got this idea to do a podcast." And I have to admit, I actually had not even really listened to all that many podcasts. And so I was skeptical, but he talked me into it, and I'm glad he did. And so now we host this weekly podcast about Virginia politics. That's a lot of fun to put together. It's a lot of work to put together, but it's satisfying work, and it's people seem to like it.
My story is not too different. I was a written journalist in digital, first in newspapers and then freelance. I've listened to a ton of podcasts since in the last decade. From Floyd to Get Anywhere, you're basically trying 45 minutes or more. And Milking Goats, those are my 2 times I had. So I listened to a ton of podcasts, including Inside Appalachia, which I now co-host. And in 2018, used part of my tax return to invest in an audio rig. Got picked up as a folk life reporter at Inside Appalachia, and then the co-hosting position just kind of unexpectedly came up. And so that's kind of my story.
Cool. All right, let's hear from our Zoom roundtable participants. I guess Patrick is up next. Patrick, tell us your podcast origin story.
Okay, my podcast origin story. Well, I think I got into journalism and podcasting kind of a backwards way. I thought I was going to be a musician, and I started college as a music major, and I was learning about theory and recording, and I decided that I wasn't good enough at that to actually do it. So I thought I could write about music, and I knew how to do all of the audio recording stuff. And at that same time, I kind of discovered This American Life, like a lot of college students, and I decided, hey, I want to do that instead. So I convinced the college newspaper to let me have a podcast where I could do whatever I want, kind of, and do silly little news stories. And then I did some art reporting and live radio mixed in. And yeah, now I make podcasts again.
Thanks. All right, Anissa, you got the floor. Up in a minute, I think our technical team is switching over to you. And while they do, I'll just say that I'm hoping for the next set of questions, I'm going to put it out there, but if you can bounce to each other panelists, it's going to be, I think, a more fun and conversational. All right, so you're on.
Should I go?
Yes, you should.
Okay. Hi, I'm Anissa Khalifa. My podcast origin story is in 2017. In 2016, I fell in love with podcasts just as a listener. And I was like, it'd be really cool if I had someone to make these with, but I didn't. And then about a year later, I was working as a critic for a Korean drama review website. And two of my colleagues there were like, hey, we're starting a podcast. Do you want to join us? And like, none of us really knew what we were doing, but we kind of taught ourselves. And that podcast is still going. And then last year, I started another podcast about sort of the generation of Muslims that came of age around the time of 9/11 and how that's affected our lives in the 20 years since and sort of our careers and all of that. And then in November, I started working in public radio. My colleague is actually Charlie. I'm at WUNC. Hey, Charlie. And there I work on a variety of podcasts, but one of them, which is new for me, is Tested, which is a reported, it's kind of a mix between news and nonfiction storytelling. So it's been really fun to sort of stretch my wings and do something new.
Thank you. Been enjoying listening to WUNC. All right, well, I got some questions and points from some of the panelists here, so I'm going to start at the very beginning. And this point comes from Brian. So I'll start with you, Brian, and then if you can ask a question of the same vein to someone else here in the panel that you're curious about, that would be really fun and keep this conversation up. You want to talk about the importance of the developmental stages and how people structure their podcasts. So why don't you kick that off and then send it over to someone else that you're curious about? Sure.
Well, basically what I wanted to kind of focus on and highlight is how to get started, how, what I've run into, in my consulting part is that a lot of different orgs, they have the idea, well, we're going to create a podcast, we're going to build this entire structure, but they don't actually, know how to go about it. There's no intent behind it. And so what they'll do is, what I've encountered is they'll roll out and they'll start promoting and they'll start talking about this ongoing podcast and this ongoing project and ongoing. And so one of the things that, I found, at least for me, I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that I found that works really well is starting off and doing seasons, is basically being seasonal in the approach and tackling one story at a time, especially for anybody that's starting off, that's getting this is their very first attempt at a podcast, their very first project, and going in a season one. And then at the end of it, you can analyze, you see what works, you see what doesn't, and you approach it from there. And I don't know if some of you guys I know have a variety of different tactics, Charlie, how do you approach it there?
Yeah, that's interesting because Tested, as Anissa mentioned, is a weekly program that we put out about 2 to 3 episodes a week. But at the same time, we're also balancing seasonal programs as well. And I totally agree that seasonal shows are perfect if someone is starting out too. That just feels like a much more approachable format for someone who's just stepping into the podcasting landscape. And also depends on how timely your reporting is within the season. But I found that it's also helpful to have the majority of the season already done before you start launching it. Again, that depends on if you're reporting a story week by week, then that's definitely flexible. But if you're doing a weekly rollout, it can be difficult to balance both the marketing of that podcast season with the like top quality production that you want to maintain. I recently was a part of a marketing podcasting webinar, because that's something that I'm interested in this year, is getting more into the marketing side. And they said that someone should be devoting at least 50% of their time to marketing their podcasts. And I said that's a very idealistic dream for a lot of folks, especially when it's a one-person team or a very small team. So long answer short, I agree that seasons are a good way to go. And at WNC, we're fortunate enough to have a good amount of podcasts where we can kind of balance that between the weekly rollout versus the seasonal rollout. Yeah.
Yeah, 50% of the time, that's quite a bit.
That sounds like someone's job to be a podcast marketer.
Exactly, yeah.
Not necessarily the producers. But.
Yeah, and I don't know if you need that, especially to start. So one of the advantages of the format is that you guys are talking about seasons, and like you will always have those seasons in the back catalog, always there. Like, so even if the numbers aren't so great at the start, which they won't be. God, like there's a million podcasts, but that's fine. People can always go back to things when you have those seasons there. The idea of having someone kind of full-time on marketing, a lot of my thoughts on it tend to be pretty similar for any creative form, which podcasting is a form of creativity, is like you do good things, you put good things out there, and they are going to sit in your back catalog for as long as they need to be, and people will eventually start to see them, and that kind of builds up. But the most important thing is always the regularity, whether that's regularity of seasons or a weekly show, which is its own can of worms. But I don't know, there's a lot of flexibility there.
One thing I'd suggest, I mean, honestly, if you've got an idea and you want to jump in, and I found it worked for me, is I did when we say I did an 8-episode narrative podcast on one subject, right? So it was very much a limited series. It was a season of one, right? And it wasn't, and when I say 8 episodes, it was 5 episodes were the narrative and 3 episodes were the bonus episode where I took a longer conversation with some of my interviewees, because, and this is probably, you leave a lot on the cutting room floor, and there are a lot of very interesting conversations you have that in a narrative form don't necessarily serve you, but you don't want to lose that. You don't want to let go of that. So the podcast format, because it's flexible enough, it allows you to do that, and you can create a different expectation for what the production is for those bonus episodes. In other words, those were just conversations where I made sure the audio was good. I didn't feel like I needed to score it. I put the ends on, and and that was it. And I would suggest, if you don't know that you can carry a podcast through from season to season, you've got an idea that seems like it might fit with that format, but you're not sure how far it's going to go. Do a limited series. The Netflix does it all the time. They're making money.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
I think it's really important to know what you want to hear as a listener. I actually am a big fan of Pod Save America, and so I feel like a lot of the decisions I make in terms of like our weekly podcast are guided sort of in that direction. Paul mentioned murder podcasts; those are great. I'm not personally, I don't listen to a lot of them. I have listened to them, but that's not necessarily my interest. That's not what I want as a listener. So I actually don't. The way I organize things, it's not necessarily seasonal based, like the way you were explaining it. It's more like weekly based in terms of a reflection of this is what's going on in the news. So I also try to think about our listeners and what our listeners want. And it's just selfishly is what I want, right, as a listener. So I also sometimes try to visualize my listeners in terms of like, are they driving? Are they at the gym? You just added one, Mason, which is, did you say milking goats? I'm going to now think about my podcast listener milking goats.
Yeah, I've occasionally tweeted at authors about listening to their audiobooks. People love that concept, but I think there's a theme I hear that when you listen to stuff that you like, listen to good shows. Y'all are talking about seasons and scoring. When I started, I was just trying to incorporate my audio recorder into my reporting. So like my first time I turned on my recorder, other than just at home, was trying to interview a tree sitter on the Mountain Valley Pipeline, trying to block 30 feet up in the air. And when I interviewed somebody close up in the support camp, it completely blew out my setting because I had the audio all wrong. And I did the thing that I like about podcasting is that it's very easy DIY. You know, I kind of come from this like punk background, and I love that you can just download Audacity for free and like start a free website with WordPress and launch a podcast that way. So I actually launched a podcast, but it wasn't really intended for public consumption. I promoted it, but it was more to like learn how to audio edit and how to be a better recorder. So by the time that I came into Inside Appalachia, like I really benefit from having a team. I need an editor for quality control. I'm interested for the folks on the, you know, for folks who are remote, like it sounds like some of the origin stories involve more of a team concept. So I'm interested in hearing that approach.
Robin, do you need to activate them or can it either speak?
I'll look at that. But I'm gonna activate.
You can hear us, right? Can you hear us?
Unmute them? Yeah, you're on.
Okay. So yeah, I think what you said about who the
Audience is really important because I agree that having a season-based approach is a lot easier. I think also another benefit, like on top of everything else that y'all have mentioned, is having seasons allows you to sort of let your topic or your subject evolve if you need it to. So, you know, a lot of times when we're planning a podcast, by the time it gets to publication, it's definitely pretty different than what we thought it was going to be. But even beyond, like once you have a first season, you might want to, you know, change your direction a little bit. And that gives you some breathing space to kind of rethink what you want to do and then launch your second season. But I think before all of that, research is really, really important. You know, why you're making this, is there a need for this? Who is your audience going to be? So for example, with Muslim in Plain Sight, which is my podcast about, you know, talking about this generation of us who grew up kind of in the shadow of 9/11, my co-host and I made a very conscious decision to sort of frame it and in tone as if we were talking to our own community, but making it open to everyone. So we have listeners who are, you know, Muslim, not Muslim, people who have grown up in the countries that we grew up in, that we're talking about also all over the world. But we made a conscious decision that who our audience, like sort of our primary audience, is going to be, because that was an audience that no one had really been speaking to before. And so we saw this gap that we wanted to fill. And a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from our listeners is also that that was something that they had not been hearing and that they wanted. So I think that research is really, really important before you even get started.
Thanks. All right, Patrick.
Yes, absolutely, totally agree. I think one of the challenges too that a lot of organizations face, especially if you're coming from a news organization, is I think that there's this idea that there's a built-in audience for your show. You know, like we are the publication of record and we make a podcast and everyone's going to listen to it. But to your point, it's kind of hard to tell who's talking in the room, so I'm sorry, but somebody said that it's a DIY approach, and that's totally true. But also that means that there's a trillion podcasts out there, and I'm sorry, but like it's impossible for someone to just like probably just find your show. So you need to go to your people who you think you are making this show for. So like one of our guiding principles at WAMU is to just imagine like 5 people, like make up 5 people in your mind, or even better, find those people that you've sort of made up in the real world and make that show for them specifically. And as you're developing the show, just have them listen to it. Like, is this fulfilling whatever need that you want out of a show? And just kind of be very mindful about who you are making this for and make sure that you are fulfilling that and get it to them proactively.
Yes, I'm really glad you brought that up. But I did want to circle back to something that Anissa said about changing, because listening to the Dish podcast, it seemed quite clear that you did change in this year. Focus on, of course, pandemic. more like economics of food delivery. Do you want to speak about that while she mentioned it? And then we'll come back to your point about audience. And then that will be the topic that we can go through next. Patrick.
Yeah, just to clarify too, some feedback. Yeah, so the show that I co-host was originally conceived as sort of I call it a sneaky food show, where we hook you by thinking we're going to talk about food and all that stuff, but it's really kind of like a sociology podcast. They're almost kind of food essays. And in the second week of March, we announced our second season. We were going to talk about all sorts of specific foods in our region, and then the funniest thing happened. So we had to kind of rework the whole show, and it very quickly became that it didn't feel good talking about like restaurants when no one could go to restaurants or no one was going to restaurants. So we kind of changed the entire show. And I think so we did a whole season about food delivery and all of the economics and social issues about that. But I think that what that signals, again, is another great point that Anissa made, is kind of the timeliness of your show and what role your show is playing in the moment, and that your show is a living, breathing thing, and that even if you had a good idea 2 years ago, you need to constantly be reassessing if what you're doing is a good idea and how it sounds now.
Yeah, and sticking with that, like, can you speak a little bit more coming from a station, and then we'll go back to Anissa and move on for those of you with the station. Make your podcast stand out from regular station programming and reporting.
How do we do that?
It
takes about 5 seconds to switch between.
All right.
He's ready.
Okay.
How do we differentiate ourselves? Is that what you were asking?
Yes, from regular programming and WAMU.
I mean, a lot of ways. I think I think the biggest thing that's different, especially just like in podcasting generally, is that it's important to realize that while you can still be a news source authoritative, you know, like we are still kind of following like journalistic ethics or whatever, but just kind of having the awareness that as a host of a show, you are also a character, and I think you need to embrace that, as uncomfortable that is, as uncomfortable as that is. And I think that's kind of the main difference, is that like you are no longer just kind of a news reporter on the air. You have become like something, I'm not saying something bigger is not the right way to say it, but you have, like, it's just a different meaning. And I don't know who said it again, but I think somebody mentioned that 50% marketing. And I think I was in that same webinar a few weeks ago, where they also said to embrace parasocial relationships, and totally agree. I think that's kind of that's another difference.
Maybe at the end you can speak more about that, but let's stick to the point that you wanted to make about audience development, knowing your audience. Who is your audience? Patrick, do you know where people are listening from? What's the profile of your listener? And then we'll send that around our table.
Like platform they're listening on, or geographically where?
Geographically, who listens to The Dish and other podcasts?
Well, again, it really depends on the show. I mean, Dish City, our food show, is locally focused. So the majority of our listenership is in the Washington metro region. Through the Cracks, our other podcast is about a DC story, but it's not necessarily aimed at a DC audience specifically. So our listenership is all over. Yeah, and then it's the audiences for all of these shows, and I don't think this is surprising, is they're generally younger than the traditional public radio audience. I mean, it varies from show to show, who and where they're listening from.
Do you have a question for anyone about audience development, or who is their audience in our roundtable here?
Yeah, I'm curious about like how the approach for some of the newsier shows. I mean, I think that seems like I don't do news personally very intentionally, and I've kind of I'm interested in the approach of news shows and how you go about seeking out your audience, if you kind of take a generalist approach, or if you're just trying to, if you've got a person in mind.
All right, Jason's ready to take that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, for Inside Appalachia, we tend to balance a mix of news stories and features. We do a lot of what our producer calls hodgepodge shows, where occasionally we'll take a topic and devote the entire, hour long, or I guess it comes out to about 50-minute show to that one topic. But a lot of times we try to mix it up, where we'll take a newsier story, for example, the wildfires breaking out across a lot of Appalachia right now, and sometimes pair that with reporter Q&As. So we do think a lot about that. One thing that's interesting about Inside Appalachia is it is a regional show. It's produced by West Virginia Public Broadcasting. So we do have staff from West Virginia. I'm from Virginia and live here. And one thing I like about Inside Appalachia is we air on 13 stations. So a lot of what we think about is why is this story in Eastern Kentucky going to matter to somebody in Southeast Ohio? And one nice thing about the podcast in particular is that we have a lot of listeners from outside Appalachia. There's a lot of expatriates from Appalachia in Charlotte or Columbus or Washington, D.C. So we know from the emails we receive that we are reaching some of those audiences. But as far as specific metrics, that's information I'd like to find out more about. I'm curious for some of the other panelists, how do you all follow some of those metrics about your audience? How deep do you dig in?
Can we hear from Michael? Because he's like, you're newsy, which Patrick brought up, you're new. Maybe there was some event that you were talking about numbers earlier. Let us know.
Sure. On the topic of sort of the bleed between sort of news coverage and using the podcast, one thing that has been really, I don't say helpful, beneficial for me is that someone else earlier on the panel talked about the cutting room floor. So like working in public radio, I get these very small spots, like a minute 20 segment, or if I'm lucky, like a 3-minute segment, which means like 98% of the audio that I collect goes on the cutting room floor. This is the beauty of the podcast. I get to use a little bit more of that. So like on election night is a good example of that. I did, I talked to more than a dozen people, and I had, a huge amount of audio on election night. And I used a very small fraction of that on the radio. So what I got to do for the podcast is use a whole lot more of that audio that I collected on election night in our podcast. And another way that it's helpful for me is I can use a back and forth. So recently I was speaking to a state senator and I didn't think he was answering my question. I said, you're changing the subject. And then he had actually a really well reasoned answer to that. But so for the radio, I wasn't able to use that back and forth, but on the podcast I was. So like it gives me a longer form, way more space to use stuff that otherwise I would have just thrown away. So I actually get a chance to use it. In terms of the audience, one thing that we were talking about the audience skewing younger. One thing I noticed being in Richmond for the General Assembly session, the elected officials are newspaper people, they're public radio listeners. But then if you talk to the staff, They're not newspaper readers. Maybe they're NPR listeners. A lot of them are podcast listeners. So like, it's actually a way to reach, I didn't do this intentionally, but I found that it's doing a podcast about state politics is a way to speak directly to all of the staff members who work for the elected officials, which is very helpful. I'd like to ask about parasocial relationships. Explain that.
I'm gonna make a note, but I
All right,
really think that Paul wants to talk about audience. Did you-
Yeah, actually, part of it, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, one thing I found, because I'm doing an investigative podcast where I'm trying to uncover a secret network that existed 100 years ago in my community, right? A part of the Underground Railroad before that name was really used. I ended up going out into the community, right? And how did I do that? I happened to be producer of my local talk show, at my affiliate. So I went on the show, I spoke about it. I had a robust web presence, mostly on Facebook. People began to reach out with their own stories about how they personally were investigating their own family history. In other words, the people in my community were already looking for some of the answers that I was looking for. And so, of course, I ended up interviewing them. I ended up swapping messages with them on Facebook and on social media and stuff. And it was for me, in terms of audience engagement, knowing who your audience is, sometimes if you properly use social media, and social media, there's a lot of downsides there, but if you properly use social media, your audience can become a very important source of stories. And it gives you the key piece of data that's not all that quantitative, it's qualitative. You know how much they care about those stories. And it allows you to really do something that's important where you reach out, you find the questions that they're really asking, and then, theoretically you can be a reporter, do your job, and add something to that. And that's what I found in the course of my work. Anissa, I would love to talk. I would love to have her talk about the people in those two groups you mentioned, because it seems to me like some of the most important work, some of the work you wanted to be doing was to have a voice of the Muslim community talking amongst itself. But some of the important work you were doing was talking to people outside of that community in the shadow of 9/11. Could you talk a little bit about that? I think your story about audience is vital.
Thank you. I think we never wanted
To exclude anyone, but the reason that we decided to, so I and my co-host, I grew up in the US, she grew up in the UK, and we've had different but sort of mirroring, it's almost like our experiences have mirrored each other, but in like a funhouse mirror way. So there's similarities, but then there's differences. And then, we are kind of bookending the season with conversations between her and I, but then all in between we're doing interviews, so we interviewed the Ms. Marvel creator, Willow Wilson, for example. We've talked to like authors and scholars, journalists, and sort of through that experience of being extremely vulnerable. And I think many of us were having these conversations with each other for the first time because there was so much fear and silence in our communities because we had to police what we were saying. And we were, viewed with so much suspicion. So for us, it was an act of courage and an act of bravery to put these conversations out there. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the podcast format, just to go on a slight tangent, is that you can have these really intimate and almost like personal conversations. And it somehow, because you're being invited into the listener space and you're inviting the listener into your space, it feels easier than, going in front of a camera and talking about it, for example. So because we made that decision, we weren't actually sure how people outside of our community would respond. We said in the first episode, this is for everyone, but we are going to prioritize our own community because it's been, pushed to the bottom of every list for such a long time, even when people were talking about us. But we actually got some really amazing feedback from our listeners who were not Muslim saying, this is a really important conversation. Thank you for sharing this. Like, I learned so much. And that was like very early on. And so it gave us the confidence to continue doing things the way we were doing and have, to feel good about like our process. And sometimes you don't get good feedback and then you have to adjust. But yeah, that's kind of, I don't know if I answered your question, but that was kind of our thinking.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna move on to another question. And I think that people who may not have spoken this round can add something as well. This point was submitted by Mason, something he wanted to talk about, which is regional reporting, geography, and giving a sense of place in podcasts. But it's interesting that some people are saying also that your listeners are from beyond our region. You said most of your listeners, many are not, don't listen on the radio, only listen on your show as a podcast. Speak about that, please.
Well, I mean, that's just when I first started listening to Inside Appalachia, WVTF didn't air it at that point. So it was just podcast only for me.
Okay.
We've expanded a little bit since then. But I find that just because of the people's cultural interest, we have listeners from outside the geographic region as well. I talked a little bit about this on my last answer, so I'm curious to hear more from my colleagues here about how it plays out for you all, your listeners in your immediate area versus those beyond. Because I know regional reporting is something that falls through the cracks a lot. Like we focus a lot on local coverage or statewide coverage or national, but a lot of the regions tend to get kind of slip through the cracks a little bit. So I'm just interested in that angle.
All right. Anyone want to send it over to?
Yes.
All just the regional stuff.
Yeah, well, that's, Hampton Roads is a weird collection of cities, right? I mean, it's a big population center. And so the idea is, and it's like, it's 20 plus, city council meetings, right? So for us, honestly, it's a constant struggle. I don't have a lot of good answers on that. I do know this, what you do is you have to find stories one at a time, and you have to find the individual person that the story matters to, and then work your way out. I mean, that's part of
interesting,
it.
because Hampton Roads does have a really strong regional identity in my mind, like
Really?
the 757, like you hear about hip hop artists coming out of that scene, you hear about sports recruits.
That's
That's
amazing that
Yeah.
you think of that us, because I think we're constantly struggling to make that happen.
It's
So
the 757.
So
right?
good
That's
for
the
us.
accurate.
Brian, I want to, one thing I want to ask you about, like in terms of finding an audience, when you look at your community, right? How do people do it wrong? How do people do coverage of Appalachia in a way that is unhelpful? And what's your message, right?
I would say, one of the main problems is something that, I think a lot of our, coverage areas have to deal with is misconceptions. The stereotypes, they come in from different areas, and they want to report on, a stereotype that they've heard, or they want to report on a story, but framing it from a specific point of view, that then when they come down, they're like, well, wait, I can't find anybody that'll comment on this. And basically the response is a lot of the time, well, yeah, because that doesn't happen here. And, a lot of times we get papers like, because I live in Southside Virginia. So that's, Danville, we get reporters coming up from Greensboro occasionally for the BH newspapers. And then also from occasionally from like the Raleigh-Durham area. And if there's a big story, and oftentimes it deals with the Confederacy, and there is, a mindset that, the entire region is just Confederate U, that is the only thing that exists there for some people. And then they come and they find all of these communities that have nothing to do with that. They find all of these communities and cultures. And I've even had, some people even for some of the magazines that I've worked with, who come up and say, wow, I didn't realize there was this many different cultures in the region. Like, kind of what, to your point, like when people hear the 757, like they automatically have a mindset about Hampton Roads. And it's the same thing with Appalachia, and especially with Southside, is you say Southside Virginia and automatically like there is something pictured in your brain. And that's what I feel like, podcasts are a way to combat that, because a lot of the people that are listening to us, these are stories. We're telling stories. We're sharing those cultures. We're sharing all of those things that sometimes in a news article or a written article, you can't really get because people aren't going to click on it. They're not going to take the time to dive into something written, but they will listen and will hear about these different cultures when they're driving down the road or something, just anytime that they can, turn the podcast on.
The tyranny of the bite, right? Is right. We fight against that because you have extra time
Exactly.
to take the beat.
Yeah.
I actually, on the topic of the 757 and the regional identity, so I think it's fascinating that Northern Virginia has a culture and there's like expectations of what it means to be in Northern Virginia and sort of the mindset. Southwest, there is a culture in Southwest Virginia, and there's expectations of sort of what the culture is. Southside is the same. I often feel when you get into Hampton Roads, I just give up because I don't know what the hell's going on in Hampton Roads. It's actually really confusing. I often say to people, the rules of gravity don't apply politically. The rules of gravity don't apply in Hampton Roads because you have to know kind of what are the grudges and sort of what are the internal conflicts. And I often think about the show Dallas, like there are the Ewings, and then so you got the Stollies, and I mean, it's a crazy, I feel like that would be a good podcast, actually. Please, somebody explain to me the politics of Hampton Roads, because I don't understand it.
That is a very good one.
I'll just jump
Yeah.
in with a quick
North
follow-up.
Carolina.
Yeah, North Carolina representing. This really speaks to me in the responsibility of who's holding the microphone. Parachuting, I think, is a problem within public radio historically, and also within podcasting as it continues to evolve as a landscape. But yeah, that's something that I feel like I try to prioritize, and I think WNC prioritizes fairly decently, is understanding that, like, going into specific communities, I might want to talk with folks and highlight stories from like Warren County, which is in like northeastern North Carolina, and there's a lot of history there, but I'm not the person to tell that story. Like I know of the history of Warren County, but I'm going to be coming in through like a voyeuristic lens as an observer. So what then happens when I turn over the microphone and just let them tell their story and work with them to construct a podcast where they're going to tell their story, instead of coming in as like the capital R reporter that then takes that audio and then tells my story of coming from this outside county, like me coming from the Triangle into a county that I'm not steeped in. That's something that I feel like WNC and myself want to do more of, is non-host narrated podcasts where we are sort of collecting stories and then working with a specific person or community to string along their narratives without this, overseeing voice as the host who kind of comes in as the sort of knower of things when that's not the reality.
Could you talk about the technical challenges you face with a non-narrative podcast? I know that's a bigger lift, right?
It is definitely, yeah. It's definitely a different approach to the interview process, because you have specific things, like you're asking folks to fill in the context when you might be doing that as the host. So that could mean more of a longevity within the relationship of your people that you're talking to, where you might have one conversation, then you realize as you're mixing the episode that y'all didn't talk about X, Y, or Z in your first conversation. So then you follow up with them and say, I want to touch on these things, and then glue that into the episode. So I think it takes more intention and more patience to construct a non-narrated episode. And, it could be one voice, it could be multiple voices, but if all the pieces kind of fall into place with the right amount of time, I think it can be something special.
it's one of those gamble things, right? Where you can't go into it with the plan for the narrative. I just got done with doing sort of like a retrospective on a radio station. And so doing a bunch of interviews, and you kind of have to jump in and hope a story comes out. And that was, in that case, there was still sort of a narrative through line going on. But I don't know how you be able to deal with, like, there's such a gamble, like, to it of you. How have you done that in the past? Or is that something you guys are working on?
Yeah, we've done it a couple of times. Anissa and I put together an episode in January about a man in North Carolina who was exonerated and eventually pardoned for a wrongful conviction. And so, like, in that case, he was pardoned by the governor. So we kind of knew that was the lead of the story. We weren't really going into that space searching for the story through the conversation, which I think might be a different approach if you were like going into a county and doing a story on the county. Like, that would just kind of be more of a canvas approach to where the through lines might be with the narrative. But in that case, for example, we knew what the crux was and then sort of expanding out from there. Yeah.
All right, let's send it over to Anissa to respond and take on the question about regional reporting, sense of place, and how you deal with that with your other two podcasts where it's crossing many boundaries and around the globe.
I think just to respond to
What Charlie said about that episode that we put together, I think also for a non-narrated podcast, you also don't always know, because you don't know what the tape is going to sound like and if the person that you're interviewing is going to be a good storyteller. So that's also something that you kind of, sometimes you don't know until you actually get into the interview and start going back through the tape. In terms of a sense of place, so I'm coming from indie podcasting and I haven't been in the news space for very long. My other podcasts have been, transnational, transcontinental, but even then, being situated where you are and in your own perspective and experience, I think adds a lot to the conversation that you're having. And it's something that I've also noticed with listeners of many of the podcasts I've done, is that listeners appreciate knowing where you're coming from. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Patrick was talking about how the host almost becomes a character. And I think that's the difference between radio and podcasting, is that because it's not live and you have more time, you have a place for your voice. And it's a hard balance to strike of like how much of your voice to actually put in there. But I think situating your place in the world is a really important part of that. And because it provides a lot of context. And, one of the things that I think journalism as an industry has been sort of struggling with over the last couple of years is like, what is unbiased journalism? Does it exist? And I think part of, being fair to everyone and not regarding some experiences as neutral and some as weighted with some kind of bias or exceptionalism is for everyone to acknowledge where they're coming from. And I think that's like geographically where you're coming from, and also what community you're from, who's speaking, as Charlie said, who's holding the mic, who you're interviewing, why are you choosing to interview those people. I think that's all really, really important to think about. And also who your listeners are, of course, as we mentioned.
All right, Patrick, you're on now on this topic of regional reporting and challenges, or the fun parts of focusing on geography and giving a sense of place in the podcast platform.
The fun parts, is that what you said?
Yeah, challenges and the fun aspect. I mean,
I can't hear you now.
Maybe of anyone on this panel. So
Sorry, you were muted for a second, so I missed half of what you just said.
Geographic area of anyone in this panel. So you have a quite unique approach to geography and giving a sense of place. So what would you like to say about it?
Well, I mean, I think the hard part about podcasting, right, is that you can make a show for as specific of a geographic area as you want, but anybody can listen to it. So there's this fun challenge of like choosing how much to explain and how much not to explain. And I think Dish City specifically, I think we choose to lean on just not explaining things, because it's a sort of if you know mentality, which is like for our local people. But we hope that the broader story is what will resonate, because that's really the important part, right? Like if you don't know that two towns are 15 miles apart from each other, like whatever. But if you can understand that, like the authenticity of a food is like relative, and like in theory, like what is authentic is meaningless or something, right? Like that's a relatable theme, right? While like geographic specificity is kind of arbitrary.
All right, the next point was brought up by Paul. You wanted to talk about what stories have you discovered that you were not looking for when making your podcast? So pick us up.
Okay, fair enough.
Send it over to someone else.
Yeah, that's fine. What I was looking for, because I was digging into a secret network of people in the 19th century. So I wanted to find descendants of these people or the remnants of these communities in the 21st century in Hampton Roads. So I ended up, and this is a problem whenever you're having a podcast in which you're discussing something that you can't quite get sound on. A lot of times you are talking to the people you're talking to, and they are going to tell you a story that's already happened. So how do you tell that story? So I found that some of the more interesting stories I found were actually happening right here today. And basically there was a community of free Black people who lived in Hampton Roads during the time before the Civil War. And it was a very robust, economically very powerful community. And at the same time, they were constantly beset by that challenge, the threat to their very survival. This community still existed in the churches that were left behind in Hampton Roads. And I already kind of knew that, but what I didn't know was that one of these churches had recently burned down by lightning, and of course it happened in a way that they talked about whether it was lightning. We think it was lightning, but at the same time, it was this Black church that it existed for decades, going almost back to the Civil War, in a gentrifying community. So it was becoming more and more white around it. And the people were clearly becoming, the average age of the parishioners were becoming older. So it was fighting for its survival in a way, for keeping alive some part of the culture in this part of Chesapeake. And I never would have found that if I hadn't had the challenge of trying to tell this story that happened 100 years ago. So one of the lessons is that you have to bring what Tom Wolfe called portable ignorance, right? You go into a situation and you do not know what you're going to get out of it, right? And I kind of want to talk to Michael Pope about that, because you have the challenge of having a conversation about politics, and that is constantly changing, right? So you're constantly being presented with these new things that you have to say something cogent and intelligent about, on more or less a deadline, right? So where have you found that challenge actually makes the product better?
Well, it's not live radio, so actually it's not like I'm put on the spot in a live setting. Although actually I do kind of structure the show to be kind of like the Kojo Namdi show on WAVU, and I actually have been had the pleasure of being on the show a couple times and being a few feet from Kojo Namdi and like watching him work and sort of watching him work the room and like host the show. And I kind of try to make the podcast sound like it's a live radio broadcast, but it's not. We go back and if we say something the wrong way, we cut that out. So it might sound like a live program. It might sound like I'm reacting in real time, but I'm not, because it's actually a recorded show. I actually wanted to touch on something that we were talking about earlier, the stuff that I found while I was looking for something else. this, if I had $1 for every time that's happened, one tip that I will give you, that this is like an actionable thing. Take your library card and then go to the website of your library and check out all of the many databases that your library card gives you access to. You will be blown away at all of the great research that you can get done just by you typing in your library card number. And I mean, I recently came across, I was looking up for information about broadband. You know, very intense topic, lots of things popped up in my search, and something that I was not looking for jumped out at me, and I was like, oh, this is really important. I should take a look at this. So just sort of action tip, go to your local library's
Michael,
website
what
and
you
check out.
discovered? What was it you discovered?
Well, I was looking for information about legislation that had passed in the recent General Assembly session. So I was looking for a sort of state-based information about broadband. And this other thing popped up that has to do with national security. And it was specific to the Pentagon, which is also a Virginia thing, but it's a national thing. So
Okay.
there's a lot to it, actually.
Who do you want to lob the question to about what have you discovered?
Well, yeah, I mean, I sort of that topic of the things I found while I was looking for something else, I think is worth thinking about. And any of the panelists, including our online folks, how important is it to sort of keep an eye out for those kinds of things? And I guess portable ignorance, I guess that's kind of actionable portable ignorance, right? Any of the panelists that would like to comment on that?
All right, raise your hand.
I'll comment real quick. Yeah, I think it's making me think about, like, when you find those things, how much do you pivot from your original approach in the story? You know, like, how much time do you then devote to that new thing that you found? Like back in September, I believe, of last year, a colleague of mine and myself went down to Robeson County in North Carolina because it had the lowest vaccination rate in North Carolina at that time. And we went to Lumberton, which is the county seat there. And we talked to the health director of Robeson County. And we were just sort of like talking to folks about the social, cultural, political nuances of why Robeson County had the lowest vaccination rate. And through the conversation with the health director, we heard from him that the numbers of calls to the poison control center had like spiked in the last couple of weeks back in September. And he referenced that a doctor in a neighboring town, Laurinburg, a certified doctor, had written an op-ed promoting ivermectin, and they kind of were, not, what is it? Causation does not equal whatever the phrase is. Correlation does not equal causation. But through that, we saw the op-ed from the doctor and the ivermectin thing, and kind of debated about how much to then focus on that and why that was an issue, in our opinion. So yeah, that's just a quick story of like a thing that crops up and then what do you do with that?
Very cool. I'm gonna move on to the next question. You cannot leave out technical issues. Mason did bring up the point about working from home, and would like to keep this going if you have a technical tip to share, but Aaryan is a producer, so I'd like him to speak, and also Brian is a freelancer, so chime in. Mason, why don't you kick it off?
I mean, I would just say I work with West Virginia Public Broadcasting, but it's completely remotely. I've never gone into their studio to record anything. I just have a chest of drawers and I set a couple of chairs upon it, put a blanket over it, and put my computer on one of the chairs. That's how I've done everything. And it's got its pros and cons, but fortunately in Floyd, we have a pretty good internet co-op. So we have pretty good internet overall, which is not the case everywhere within Appalachia or even our coverage area here. And I'm curious to hear about your technical work.
In terms of what?
I mean, just, do you work in studio? Do you work from home? Do you do both? How was it during the pandemic?
I mean, honestly, I got to work in a studio for about 2 months before the pandemic started. And so most of that rest of it had been kind of at home. You can do a ton at home. You were talking about downloading Audacity for free. I like to, I was talking about the sort of first podcast I made back this was like 7-8 years ago now. And I kind of figured out how to get every step of it from like recording it, to hosting it, to putting it on the, to editing and putting it on the internet, all that stuff can be done for free through, it's much more MacGyvering than it really should be done. It's much easier now to just pay $10 a month to post it online. But everything that you need is able to be done at home pretty much with as good of quality as a studio. You talk about all you really need to record is a decent mic and something soft around you.
Yeah. How do you all approach that with remote guests? Because that's something that we've gone through the weeds with a lot in the past 2 years of how we get good quality audio from our
We
guests.
use an app a lot called Zencaster. It's free. You don't have to download anything. You do need Google Chrome.
Mhm.
But I've had a couple of instances where someone's had an older computer. I interviewed an iconic children's author.
Mm.
She had an older computer and the fan cut on about 5 minutes into it. And we had to redo the whole thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you just need to have your ears open. I guess.
Zencaster is great. So the key thing is that, I mean, well, it's not a bad thing to record over Zoom or something like that, especially in the last few years. I think we've all become accustomed to these sort of like, not the best audio through Zoom. It's acceptable, but because everyone was recording at home anyway, we've all kind of gotten used to it in a way we wouldn't have before. Now that things are getting to be more in person, stuff like Zencaster, the big deal is that it records locally, which is to say you're having the call, but rather than recording what's getting put through the internet to someone else, which is they sort of compress it and all that stuff, just so it's not huge audio files, using a service like that or recording an Audition or Audacity kind of on your own side, that records what's going right into your mic, which is much crisper, nicer, much more solid. One thing that we did just as a random, often our phones are at this point, the mics are great on your standard iPhone for the last like 5 years. So we would have a Zoom call and record that for safety, and that would be pretty stable, but not great. Half the time, if somebody just has their phone next to them as they're speaking, that audio is as good or better, right? And so that can really work. It's never going to sound as great as when you're in the studio with somebody, but at this point we're getting relatively close.
One thing I add, distance is more important than equipment. In other words, and I've done this, and we're all, most of us are reporters here. You get better audio from a phone that's right up close to the person than you do with the world's best mic that's standing even a few feet away, especially if you're outside. Outside, the wind is, and we've talked about this before, right? I mean, no matter how good you are, please, somebody jump in and tell me I'm wrong here, but no matter how good you are with all those knobs and all that equipment, if you are putting in a sound that has a lot of wind in it, you're gonna trade off either taking the wind out and making the sound thin, or you're going to just leave the wind in. So getting up close to someone with your equipment and having that is, I think that's key. And I think one of the most important things is sort of the social engineering early on, where you set expectations that, I'm going to interview you, and I got to tell you, I'm just going to make sure that the sound is going to be good, and just get the person comfortable with the idea that this audio is like a third character. It's like the friend that no one wants, your microphone, right? It's hanging out. It's Steve, right? Let's call it Steve, right? It's like the thing in the room that's going to be a problem, and let's make Steve happy before the interview happens. And if you do that, then it saves you all kinds of headaches at the back end, right?
I once heard a good theory about sound quality, which is someone compared it to bad breath, right? So if the audio quality is really, really good and you invest a lot of money and a lot of effort and you really work hard at getting your sound quality, you will not notice it. You won't think about it, right? It'll just blend into the background. But if the audio quality is bad, you will notice it, right? So that's something that I always struggle with, especially with the guests, with the remote guests. And I'm not to sound like a commercial for Zencaster, but if you compare Zoom to Zencaster, the audio quality on Zencaster is way much better.
Nice.
So when I'm listening to podcasts, I often say to myself, "Oh, is this Zoom audio? I don't know. Do I want to listen to this?" And I have to admit, as a podcast listener, I often stop listening to stuff if I think that the audio quality is not really good. I'll listen to something else. So I'll turn the question back on you. How do you deal with that?
Oh,
You asked the question.
Well, yeah, we've gone the voice memo route. That's been most reliable, is just asking the folks to tape sync themselves. as we're recording it back up on Zoom. And then the biggest hurdle is, depending on how long the conversation is, getting them to share the file with us, which is, there's just a lot of.
Could you, just in case people are listening who don't, could you explain that a little, tape syncing?
Yeah.
Because it was new to me when I jumped into podcasting, honestly, and it really saved,
go for it.
Sure, yeah, real quick. Like if you're talking to someone on Zoom, make sure they have their headphones on so that the Zoom audio doesn't bleed into their phone that they're recording. And so simultaneously, they'll open up the voice memo app and record themselves. Just, so I ask people to hold it similar to a normal microphone, like 6 to 8 inches away from where they're speaking. Because I've had folks, I'd say like, record yourself on your phone and then they'll put it on a table like 5 feet away, and that doesn't do anything for us. So yeah,
I was
that'll be a
telling them to
local
hold their
resource
iPhone
thing.
up to their ear as they're listening.
Just like they're talking on the
Because
phone.
if a lot of people just instinctively do this, I say, do not do that because you'll breathe into the phone, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I always tell people, hold it up to your ears if you're talking on the phone.
Yeah, definitely. That minimizes the pee popping. And then it's a whole thing of getting the file over to you, whether it's email or Dropbox, whatever. But yeah, that's just it. But anyways, what's been your experience? Brian?
As a freelancer?
Pretty much, I don't really have anything to add. I mean, we've
Okay.
covered it, except I will praise against Zencaster. I mean, it is night and day. I mean, just like Michael said, I think compared to Zoom. And then also, I mean, I will definitely steal that trick about holding them, convincing people to hold it to the ear, because I mean, that's outstanding, because I do run into the problem of, you hear the breathing, you hear the wind, you hear every single thing pouring in as they're, shoving it up to their mouths. And I mean, no, that's a great tool that I'll take away from this.
All right, let's go back to Patrick. I don't want to not have a chance to hear more about parasocial relationships. Send that question around about relationships with your listeners, but also has it led to anything? Any good story ideas? Do you want to take on technical? Because I mean, are you going back out into the field as well before parasocial relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I will also say that there is room for imperfection in audio. I mean, I think a lot of the obviously it's great to like try to make your audio sound perfect, right? But I think oftentimes too, the sound, like I actually think a really good example of this is when like Radiolab will show up with their mic like knocking on somebody's door, right? That's a great example of making the recorder and the microphone a character. And I think what that demonstrates to me is just showing up with everything rolling already. You've got your headphones, you've got your microphone, and you're just kind of leaning into the sort of awkwardness and weirdness of doing a podcast interview and just kind of making it part of the thing. And then also sort of having the sound of the jostling around, right, is like technically wrong, I guess, right? You don't want to have the sound of that picked up on the microphone necessarily, but also it can sound kind of cool if used creatively. The parasocial relationship thing, yeah, I think that's related to the kind of being a character on your show, and then what Anissa added about how much of yourself you're sharing and what you think about whatever thing you're talking about on your show, because of just the medium itself. Your listeners think they know you, which is can be good and bad. There are obviously pros and cons to that, but I do think it's a way to find stories, because people want to share with you more, but also it's a really great way to market the show. I mean, for our first season, every week we had basically my co-host and I would show up at a bar, and then people could come and hang out, and like that was the event. But like we thought like 5 people would come, and then like 30 people came every week, and we just hung out, and that ended up being a great way to like build an audience survey. And then we could hand out like merch and stuff. And then people got to be like, oh, what's it like making the show? And like, people love that stuff. And it's also just like it was cheap. We spent like $200 on stickers for the show. And then we went to a restaurant, right? So like, it's a very low effort, low financial investment way to market your show and yourself.
Thank you. And Anissa, we could see you nodding. So tell us some anecdotes, some thoughts that came to mind while Patrick was speaking about parasocial relationships.
Yeah, I think
So I've experienced this most through my K-drama podcast, which I've had for 5 years at this point. And because we're kind of in a fandom space already, people are already coming to the subject with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of love for, the TV shows and the actors that they love. And so there's like already that's something that you can connect on with the listeners immediately. But then also over the years, we've, shared a lot about our lives. We've kind of gone through the pandemic together. In 2020, we had like a virtual tea for our listeners on Christmas because we knew a lot of them were not able to travel and see their families. And so even though none of us actually celebrate Christmas, we're like, let's do this and just have a little community space. And it was really lovely. And I don't know, but because we had built that relationship with them over time, we were able to, eventually start a Patreon. We get emails from our listeners. And so it is kind of a difficult line to tread because I think you have to really think carefully about how much you do want to share about yourself, because ultimately, no matter how authentic you feel you're being, you can never put your full self into what you're making. And I don't think it's probably a good idea to put your full self into what you're making. But as Patrick said, people do feel as though they know you. And also once you put something out on the internet, it's going to be there forever. So you have to really think about who your public persona is and whether you might regret talking about something later. So far, I have not had any bad experiences in that regard, at least not from my podcast listeners. Random dudes on the internet is another thing that women deal with all the time. But I think the important thing to remember with these parasocial relationships is like not to have false expectations. And I think that can be something that listeners also run into, is having false expectations of the person that they're following. But as a person who creates content, just to kind of respect that relationship for what it is and not go beyond the bounds of it. So for example, if you are so for us with our K-drama podcast, we're very careful about we have people who donate to the podcast monthly. And, we really appreciate all the contributions that they give. But one of our rules is that we wouldn't ask a patron on for an interview simply because they listen to us and they financially contribute, because that feels like an ethical line that we don't want to cross. So I think it's just really important to think about this stuff before it actually comes up, and to have, just to think things through and be very clear about what you're doing, because once you let the genie out of the bottle on the internet's forever, right? So.
Thank you. Michael, you want to know about parasocial relationships. So what do you think about what they're saying? And do you have any anecdotes to share?
Well, I want to schedule a happy hour now, actually. I can use that. Get some stickers for our podcast and schedule a happy hour. Although it'd be difficult because, we were talking about the pandemic and doing remote. And I live in Alexandria. My co-host lives in Richmond. We're never in the same room together. So in fact, I haven't been in the same room with him for many, many months. And so actually doing the happy hour would be very difficult. I'd like to hear from our panelists, the podcast that you find inspiring or that you like, or things that you might want to emulate. Any examples of sort of maybe podcasts that I haven't heard of or things I should check out? And how about our virtual people, any sort of, or things that you like or that you might want to emulate?
I actually find that the things I listen to are nothing like the things that I make, actually. And I don't know if that's some sort of separation from work. But I will have my personal endorsement be a show called Off Book, which is a show I think I heard a laugh. Yeah, it's a ridiculous show where they improvise an entire musical. And that's the show. And they sing the songs and it's hilarious, but I think it's also a great, it's a technical feat. It's like a creative feat. I don't know. I just love it.
That sounds delightful. I'm gonna go check that out. My favorite podcast is not
One that you haven't heard of, I'm sure. It's NPR's Code Switch. I just really love their combination of incredibly great reporting, amazing interviews, and also just, I mean, not anymore because they're currently in search for a host to replace Shireen. But before Shireen left, that really amazing interplay between the hosts, which was partially because they've been friends for many years and partially because they're both just really, really good at what they do. And that magical combination, and also in addition to that, just the fact that I really find the topic that they cover really fascinating. And it's, like what I've studied in school and something that I write about and think about a lot. Like that's definitely my recommendation, but I know it's not like an unknown or an indie podcast, but it's definitely my favorite.
Anyone else in the panel here?
I've listened to a lot fewer podcasts since the pandemic, just because I'm not commuting as much. And also because we're not milking our goats for the first time in 5 years. But I really liked the BBC documentary, which is 20 something minutes, longer form podcast. I just like the depth and the scope of what they do. I like the Bundyville podcast with Leah Sotelli. It was that's kind of my background as well, was kind of coming up in sagebrush rebellion counties out west. And then just as far as like a narrated podcast, I really like listening to You Must Remember This, which is Hollywood history. Those are all, kind of like Patrick said, they're not quite what I do. Those are more related to personal interests. How about y'all?
Yeah, I think first of all, yeah, what Patrick shared, that totally resonates with me. I feel like when I'm listening to stuff that's close to what I help produce, I have like my editor ears on and I just get frustrated with it. But something that I want to emulate is with our podcast Tested, which is like a long form news podcast. I really appreciate what Today Explained from Vox does, where they have two hosts or like host and a reporter in the studio together, but one host is sort of telling the story to the other host. And it's sort of like a non-scripted, but still structured format to telling a story, because I feel like with Tested, we often kind of fall into this public radio formula of like a very long feature script for the podcast, which I want us to move more away from, because podcast is distinct from the public radio feature format. And I think Today Explained does a good job. It's similar to like what Radio Lab does in This American Life sometimes, of it's like someone telling the story to the host with like sound bites and everything mixed in. But I think Today Explained does a good job of that through news format.
Yeah, you were talking about how your editor ear is always on if you're listening to stuff. For the most part, when I think of shows I listen to, they're fairly unedited. Like it's more about like following people, who you want to hear, and then kind of the technical side of it, I don't really care about when listening. One thing that an area that is sort of similar but not exactly the same as podcasts is there's a lot of what they call video essays on YouTube now, which sort of use the similar, like we are telling some sort of narrative or talking or exploring some kind of topic, investigating this anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours long. There was one that was a really big takedown of NFTs, and so they use a lot of similar tactics in sort of telling a story or investigating something, obviously with the aid of visuals. But there is, I think, a lot to learn from the maybe it's a slightly different format from the things that I spend my time doing. So it's less editor brain, but there's a lot of interesting stuff there to kind of look into.
Right.
You had mentioned murder podcasts. Is there any ones that you like?
Yeah, well, actually, the latest mystery or investigative podcast I'm listening to is the Trojan Horse Affair, right? And that's the podcast about it happens in Britain. There was a scandal where there was these allegations early on in the right after 9/11, about, actually not right after 9/11, a few years after 9/11, about these radical Islamic groups within the schools, and it turned out a lot of it was based on a fake document. But there's all kinds of controversy about the podcast itself, and it made me, and I think Anissa was talking about the fact that, you know, about objectivity being something that we throw around, a term that we throw around, but it's hard to say what objectivity is, or if objectivity privileges a certain, you know, point of view. So when I listen to the Trojan Horse Affair podcast, I'm wrestling. I don't have my podcast hat on. I got my reporter hat on, and I'm constantly wrestling with these questions of, this thing definitely has a point of view. Okay, is that bad? Is that always bad? I don't know. And part of me, the reporter part says, well, no, you're supposed to be objective, right? But then again, here's a point of view that was not aired in anything approaching, you know, with anything approaching, you know, fairness at the time. And so they now have people coming forward to give their opinions. And I think, well, maybe we should be listening to this. And yeah, it's gripping stuff. And it's very much, you know, an investigation that I'm hooked, right?
On the topic of formats and different formats, you mentioned Today Explained, which is like two people and having a conversation. One of them knows absolutely nothing about whatever it is, right? And the other person is like the expert. There's another really good podcast called You're Wrong About that has that approach, where one person sort of comes to it like knowing everything about a topic, and the other person, so they have this conversation where one explains that topic to the other person. That's a really interesting format. One thing that I've noticed about that, I've always had my editor ears on. When I'm listening to that, I'm thinking, a lot of this is scripted. It sounds like they're having a conversation. And so this is an interesting topic that I'd love to get panelists on. Like when you're listening to something that sounds like a conversation, a lot of times, if you think about it, it's got to be scripted, right? So like, how do you draw that line between just sort of spontaneous conversation? There's a great podcast, I don't think it's done anymore, called Whistle Stop, where it was the guy from CBS, it was about politics. And it sounds like he's just talking to you kind of extemporaneously, but then he will quote long passages from a book that he's read. And I'm thinking, well, clearly he's got a script in front of him, right? So like,
Can you send it over to Patrick?
yeah, sure. Like, how do you draw that line between being spontaneous versus scripted? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's the artifice, right? I mean, like, that's the line between being a character and being like, there is a suspension of, I believe that's not the right thing to say, but like, in any sort of like narrative work that you're doing, especially podcasting, right? Like, there is a sort of, I think manipulation maybe is a more malicious sounding word than I think it is, but like, you're leading people on like through an arc, right? And there's obviously like practice that goes into like making it, maybe you don't actually know like what that tape was going to say when your co-host said it to you, or maybe you did and you've heard it for 7 million times, I don't know. But like, there is just like a sort of like non-journalistic element to like how those things are presented that just is part of the medium, I guess. Is that a satisfying answer?
Can I just add something really quick?
Hold on a second, Anissa, we're gonna activate your audio.
Yes.
And then we'll open up to questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add
That probably nobody wants to hear your unedited rambling either. So as a consideration of your listeners, I mean, even for the, you know, my non-WUNC podcasts are generally long form interview conversations. And even for the ones where it's just me and my co-host talking, we always have an outline of what we're talking about beforehand. And we don't generally come into the conversation knowing nothing about what the others are going to say, because that just doesn't make for a very interesting conversation to listen to. So even if it's just like bullet points, it's an active consideration towards your listeners to actually have a plan instead of just turning the mic on and speaking.
Thank you. All right, we have a few minutes where we can open up to the floor. Sorry? All right, so any time for how many?
You do whatever you
Okay,
want.
does anyone in the room have a question? And you are monitoring Zoom chat, Robin Reed?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I see a hand in the back.
Some technical questions. I'd like to know what hosting service that you use. I'm familiar with Libsyn, but I want to know what else is out there and how you're tracking your analytics. And then to the marketing question, some of you are already working in organizations that can do some of that marketing for you, but what is some other maybe grassroots or personal marketing that you're doing? I mean, how much cross promotion on social media? I think the like bar and stickers is a really interesting thing. So technical question about hosting services and analytics, and then marketing.
The question was hosting, analytics, and marketing. Who would like to take that question?
I mean, hosting service wise, you can just throw out names of things. I've used Libsyn is good. Pinecast is another one I like quite a bit. We use Spreaker for Pod Virginia. A lot of them have the analytics kind of built into them at this point. You know, they can collect it from Spotify and Apple and all that stuff. So that's not too hard. Marketing wise, I don't know anything. So that can go to something else.
Anyone for marketing want to speak on marketing? Maybe we'll have a session next year on marketing or online.
I'm definitely a novice to marketing, so I'm just going to repeat things that other people have told me. But I've heard that like networking with other podcasts is a good way to just sort of start out if you don't have sort of an infrastructure at your organization that you can lean onto. Yeah, cross promotions, cross feeds. Cross feeds are really helpful if you need sort of like a bye week in your season rollout where you can put in a like-minded show into your feed and they might be willing to do the same. So yeah, I've heard that word of mouth, but through like a concentrated effort through like social media or through promos and other shows, things like that. It's a good way to start out. But again, I'm a novice, so I don't really have metrics to report back on the efficiency of it.
Patrick,
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar, and I would just add that like for your low budget promotion, kind of stay in the podcast realm if you can. I think I subscribe to the idea that it's hard, like getting people to know about your show is one thing, but getting people to actually listen to it is another thing. So if you can eliminate a step by like, you know, following us on Twitter, sure, but you have to get that person from Twitter to their wherever they're going to listen. So if you can get people in their podcast app, highly endorse that.
I'm gonna say a quick follow-up to using social media. Something that I was told recently is if you like put out a tweet and put a link to your episode in your main tweet, Twitter will sometimes bury that tweet because they don't want, like similar to Facebook, they don't want people going away from Twitter. So they want people staying on the app. So it's more effective to do like a catchy one sentence as your main tweet, and then in a subtweet put the link to the episode.
Any other questions in the room? Yes.
For those of you that are focused on those areas where there is a lot of that parachute journalism, was there any initial resistance from the people that you're talking about? And if so, how did you overcome that?
I'll tell you, I'd say yes. I mean, I've been in Southside Virginia since 2016, and even now it's much less prevalent, but there is still well, you're not from here. And there's that mindset. It just takes time. I mean, that's the best thing that I can say. And there's no quick fix. There's nothing else. People have to trust you, and you have to build that trust through months and sometimes years of work to where they get to know you better.
I think too, that's playing with the objectivity question that we were talking about earlier, in that I think it's important to maintain a collaborative relationship with those people that you're working with in communities that you're not a part of, in the sense that like it's not just about collecting the interviews and then you go off and do your story and then you put it out and then like send them a link and say, hey, here's the thing that I've created. I think it's more of a balanced and appropriate relationship to make sure that they're okay with the story, which I know is challenging some traditional rules of journalism and reporting, but that's kind of what podcasting is, challenging journalism. So
It's like having a deep source.
yeah.
You know,
No, that's good.
you have a
That's
deep
good way to put
source, the deep source has to trust you, and at the same time, the journalism's there's always an element where you've got to, I'm going to run with it and I'm going to do what I'm going to do with it, you know, so, but you have to respect you, openness, honesty, remember that you're not the expert.
I actually find myself often questioning the ethics of letting people know ahead of time what I'm going to ask them, which is like one of the cardinal rules in journalism. You don't do that. You don't tell people ahead of time. But for a podcast, I've got like this thing, I'm trying to format it, I'm trying to structure it. So I will let, so like, I'm kind of violating one of the rules of journalism by letting them know what I'm going to ask them ahead of time, but it helps structure the show too. So like, there's a reason for doing it, but is that not crossing boundaries doing that? I don't know. Oof.
There was one more question. I think you're the last.
Thank you, panelists. As field reporters, kind of low-level employees in your organization, maybe that's just me, what successes have you had convincing your bosses that your idea for a podcast or the next story is a good idea?
Oh my God. Great question.
Yeah, so great.
I would just say, Inside Appalachia, I've had very good luck. They pretty much sign off on everything that I pitched them. Crazily enough, the one exception was an interview I pitched with a former coworker, Beth Macy.
Oh.
But it was because there had been another station reporter had interviewed her within the previous 3 months. But otherwise, they tend to be receptive, and I think it helps that some of the episode ideas we've pitched, like let's build an episode around this idea, have really hit with readers. So like that's, I think the success has built success, I think, in that case. I would defer to others.
Anyone else have an answer to that? Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't hear on Zoom. How do you, let me see if I can, how do you convince the higher ups that your idea is a good one for a podcast? Yeah. Anissa? Patrick?
Well, I haven't actually
Had bosses for more, I had them for like 5 months. Before that, it was basically my own creative freedom. So it's definitely a different experience. But at the same time, I would say that, I haven't launched a new podcast while I've been at WUNC, but pretty much all of the ideas that I've pitched so far, my editors said yes. And Charlie's been a really great mentor, honestly. So my experience has been great.
Patrick, you might have the last word.
Oh boy. I'm for Dish City and then Through the Cracks, our other current show. They both were products of people just kind of doing things independently outside of their jobs. When I started the show, I was not a podcast producer. And in fact, the show started as a joke between my co-host and I, but then we just kind of started doing it. And then we eventually managed to convince our boss that we should do it. And now it's my job, which is kind of cool. But I think, especially considering that people are figuring out what podcasts are for, I would just recommend just trying it out and see what you come up with. And it's a process, but just experiment a little bit and have fun.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Our time has come to an end on this really exciting, informative, and fun podcaster roundtable. So I want to thank all of our panelists for coming in today. It's been really great connecting with all of you. I hope you can continue this conversation at lunch and throughout the conference, and let's all keep in touch and connect in all of the different ways that we can. Thank you. Bye.